René Descartes was born in 1596 in the small town of La Haye-en-Touraine, a quiet provincial setting far removed from the intellectual centers that would later define his career. Late 16th century France was still marked by the aftermath of religious wars, political uncertainty, and deep social divisions. Descartes entered the world at a time when traditional authority was being questioned, but had not yet been replaced by new systems of thought. This atmosphere of instability would later resonate with his lifelong search for certainty and method. His family belonged to the lower provincial nobility, a social position that offered respectability without great wealth. Descartes' father served as a legal official within the regional administration, a role that placed the family within the educated governing class of France. This background provided young René with exposure to law, order, and rational procedure from an early age. The household valued discipline, learning, and social responsibility, shaping an environment in which intellectual ambition was encouraged, even if not yet fully understood. Descartes' early family life was marked by personal loss. His mother died shortly after his birth, leaving him physically fragile and emotionally shaped by absence rather than nurture. This loss contributed to his being raised largely by relatives and caretakers, a situation that encouraged introspection and independence. From infancy, Descartes was described as delicate in health, a condition that would follow him into adulthood and influence the contemplative rhythm of his life. Physical vulnerability, rather than limiting him, pushed him inward toward thought and reflection. The household into which Descartes was born combined traditional Catholic values with a practical respect for education. Although not destined initially for philosophy or mathematics, René was expected to pursue a respectable path within the structures of church, law, or administration. His father's position ensured access to schooling and books, privileges unavailable to most of the population. This early access to learning would later prove decisive, allowing Descartes to engage deeply with classical texts and emerging scientific ideas. Equally important was the contrast between Descartes' provincial origins and the broader intellectual currents of Europe. Growing up far from universities and royal courts, he developed without immediate pressure to conform to established schools of thought. This distance fostered a certain intellectual freedom. He was not born into an environment dominated by scholastic debate, but into one shaped by routine, law, and lived experience. The gap between inherited tradition and lived reality would later become central to his philosophical method. Descartes' birth and family background thus provided a paradoxical foundation. He emerged from a world of order and tradition, yet one marked by loss, fragility, and distance from intellectual authority. These conditions nurtured a mind inclined to doubt inherited certainty and to seek firm foundations through reason alone. Long before he formulated his famous philosophical principles, the circumstances of his birth had already set the stage for a life devoted to questioning, clarity, and the pursuit of indubitable truth. The early childhood of René Descartes was shaped as much by physical fragility as by intellectual promise. From infancy, he was known to be unusually delicate in health, suffering from recurring illnesses that often confined him indoors. In a period when childhood disease was common and medical knowledge limited, his survival was uncertain. This physical weakness, however, altered the rhythm of his life in a way that proved formative, drawing him away from strenuous activity and toward quiet observation and reflection. Because of his fragile condition, Descartes was often granted privileges unusual for children of his time. He was allowed extended rest, late mornings, and long periods of solitude, habits that would later become characteristic of his adult life. These hours of stillness were not empty. Confined to rooms and gardens, he learned to attend closely to his own thoughts. Physical limitation fostered mental independence, encouraging him to explore questions internally rather than through constant external engagement. From an early age, Descartes displayed a striking curiosity about the natural world. Everyday phenomena, light entering a room, the movement of objects, the patterns of sound, became sources of fascination. Rather than accepting explanations based on authority or tradition, he instinctively sought causes. This tendency toward questioning, even in childhood, hinted at the philosophical temperament that would later challenge centuries of inherited doctrine. Observation preceded belief, a habit quietly formed long before formal education. Books played a central role in nurturing his curiosity. With access to family resources and tutors, Descartes read widely, encountering classical texts alongside religious instruction. Yet, even as he absorbed traditional learning, he sensed its limitations. Stories, doctrines, and explanations often contradicted one another, prompting an early awareness of uncertainty. This exposure to conflicting ideas planted the seeds of skepticism, not as rejection, but as disciplined inquiry. His childhood environment further reinforced this intellectual independence. Raised away from major intellectual centers, Descartes was not immediately immersed in rigid scholastic traditions. This distance allowed curiosity to develop organically rather than under strict institutional control. He learned to think before learning how to argue, to wonder before being told what was correct. The countryside, with its slower pace and observable natural rhythms, offered a quiet laboratory for reflection. By the time Descartes entered formal schooling, the foundations of his intellectual character were already set. Fragile health had encouraged solitude. Solitude had nurtured reflection, and reflection had awakened curiosity. What might have been a limitation became an advantage, shaping a mind accustomed to questioning appearances and seeking underlying order. His childhood did not yet reveal the philosopher he would become, but it forged the habits of thought, patience, skepticism, and attentiveness that would later transform European philosophy. The formal education of René Descartes began at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in early 17th century France. Founded under royal patronage, the college represented the highest standards of Catholic and humanist learning. For the young Descartes, entering La Flèche meant stepping into a world of disciplined study, intellectual authority, and carefully structured knowledge, an environment that would both shape and later provoke his philosophical rebellion. The Jesuit curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive. Students were trained in classical languages, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and natural philosophy, all grounded in the Aristotelian scholastic tradition. Instruction emphasized clarity of argument, precision of language, and obedience to established authorities. Descartes excelled academically, quickly distinguishing himself as an exceptionally capable student. Yet even as he mastered the material, he began to sense a tension between technical brilliance and genuine understanding. The elegance of scholastic reasoning did not always convince him that it delivered certainty. Particularly influential was Descartes' exposure to mathematics. Unlike other disciplines, mathematics offered results that were clear, demonstrable, and free from contradiction. Proofs did not rely on ancient authority or theological interpretation, but followed necessity and logic. This contrast left a deep impression. While he respected the intellectual discipline of his teachers, Descartes increasingly questioned why other fields could not achieve the same level of certainty. Mathematics planted the first seeds of his later belief that knowledge must be built upon foundations as firm as geometry. At the same time, Descartes grew dissatisfied with scholastic natural philosophy. Much of it depended on inherited explanations rather than direct inquiry, repeating concepts that had gone largely untested for centuries. Although he absorbed these teachings thoroughly, he sensed that they described the world without truly explaining it. This dissatisfaction did not lead to immediate rejection, but to quiet doubt. La Flèche trained him to argue well. It also taught him how fragile argument could be when detached from clear principles. The Jesuit emphasis on moral discipline and introspection also left its mark. Students were encouraged to examine their thoughts, regulate behavior, and pursue intellectual honesty. These practices subtly reinforced habits of self-examination that would later become central to Descartes' method of doubt. Even the spiritual exercises of the Jesuit tradition, focused on internal reflection, helped shape his inward philosophical style. Ironically, an institution designed to preserve orthodoxy helped cultivate a thinker who would challenge its intellectual foundations. By the time Descartes completed his studies at La Flèche, he possessed one of the finest educations Europe could offer. Yet he emerged not with confidence in inherited knowledge, but with uncertainty about its ultimate reliability. He later remarked that despite years of study, he found himself doubting almost everything he had been taught. The Jesuit college had succeeded in giving him intellectual tools, but it had also revealed the limits of tradition. Education at La Flèche was therefore both formative and transformative. It provided Descartes with discipline, analytical skill, and deep familiarity with classical learning. At the same time, it awakened his desire for a new foundation of knowledge, one based not on authority, but on reason alone. From within the walls of one of Europe's greatest schools emerged a thinker prepared not to defend tradition, but to rebuild philosophy from the ground up. From an early stage in his intellectual development, René Descartes showed a growing fascination with mathematics and philosophy, not as separate disciplines, but as complementary paths toward certainty. While many of his contemporaries accepted inherited knowledge as sufficient, Descartes was increasingly unsettled by the contradictions and ambiguities he encountered in traditional learning. This unease did not lead him to reject study altogether. Instead, it sharpened his desire to identify forms of knowledge that could withstand doubt and deliver unquestionable truth. Mathematics quickly emerged as a unique source of intellectual satisfaction. Unlike rhetoric, natural philosophy, or theology, mathematical reasoning produced results that were clear, demonstrable, and universal. A proof, once completed, did not depend on authority or interpretation. For Descartes, this precision was deeply compelling. It suggested that the human mind was capable of achieving certainty, provided it followed the correct method. Mathematics became more than a technical skill. It was a model for how all knowledge might be structured. At the same time, Descartes' philosophical curiosity deepened. He began to question not only specific claims, but the foundations upon which knowledge itself rested. Why did so many learned arguments conflict with one another? Why did entire systems of thought rely on principles that could not be clearly demonstrated? These questions drew him toward philosophy, but not in its traditional scholastic form. Rather than debating established doctrines, he sought to understand how the mind arrives at truth and how error arises in the first place. What distinguished Descartes' early interest was the way he linked mathematics and philosophy through method. He sensed that the certainty found in mathematics was not accidental, but the result of orderly reasoning and clearly defined principles. If such a method could be identified and applied more broadly, then philosophy might escape endless dispute and achieve the same clarity as geometry. This insight would later become central to his intellectual project, but its origins lay in these early reflections on mathematical certainty. Descartes' engagement with philosophy was therefore practical as well as theoretical. He was less interested in what to think than in how to think correctly. This focus on method led him to value simplicity, clarity, and logical progression. Complex explanations that relied on obscure concepts or appeals to tradition failed to satisfy him. He increasingly believed that true understanding required breaking problems down into their simplest components and rebuilding them step by step. These early interests also shaped his attitude toward learning itself. Descartes did not see education as the accumulation of opinions, but as a process of refinement, discarding what was uncertain and retaining only what could be clearly justified. Mathematics gave him confidence that such refinement was possible, while philosophy provided the space to question assumptions without restraint. Together, they formed the intellectual core of his youthful ambitions. By the time Descartes began to envision his future, mathematics and philosophy were no longer isolated interests. They had merged into a single pursuit: the search for indubitable knowledge grounded in reason alone. This early synthesis set him apart from his peers and prepared him for the revolutionary path he would later follow. Long before he articulated his famous principles, Descartes had already committed himself to a lifelong task: to discover a method by which the human mind could move from doubt to certainty with the same confidence found in mathematical proof. After completing his formal education, René Descartes deliberately stepped away from academic life and chose a path that appeared, at first glance, unconventional for a future philosopher. He entered military service, not out of a desire for glory or long-term command, but as a means of experiencing the world directly. For Descartes, books alone were no longer sufficient. He believed that true understanding required exposure to different peoples, customs, and ways of thinking, and the army offered a practical route across Europe at a time of widespread conflict. Descartes served as a soldier during the early phases of the 30 Years' War, a period marked by political fragmentation, religious tension, and shifting alliances. His service placed him within disciplined structures, yet also exposed him to chaos and uncertainty on a continental scale. Military life introduced him to the contrast between rigid order and unpredictable reality, reinforcing his sense that human systems often lacked firm foundations. Rather than shaping him into a conventional officer, this environment deepened his habit of reflection and detachment. What distinguished Descartes from many soldiers was his use of travel as an intellectual experiment. Moving through regions such as the Netherlands, Germany, and Central Europe, he observed differences in law, belief, and custom. Practices considered unquestionable in one place were rejected in another. These encounters strengthened his skepticism toward inherited authority and local tradition. The diversity of European life suggested to him that many convictions rested on habit rather than reason, a realization that would later inform his method of systematic doubt. Periods of isolation during his travels proved especially significant. Descartes often withdrew from social life, spending long hours alone in rented rooms or military quarters. In one such period of solitude, he experienced a profound intellectual awakening, later describing it as a moment when the foundations of a new philosophy began to take shape. Removed from academic institutions and freed from expectation, he found clarity in reflection. Travel, paradoxically, led him inward. The experience of war also shaped his philosophical temperament. Witnessing instability, destruction, and the fragility of political order reinforced his belief that certainty could not be grounded in external structures alone. Empires shifted, doctrines clashed, and institutions failed. Yet the act of thinking itself remained constant. This realization pushed Descartes toward the idea that the only secure starting point for knowledge must lie within the reasoning mind, independent of circumstance or authority. By the time Descartes withdrew from military life, his travels had accomplished their purpose. He had tested learning against experience and found experience equally unreliable without method. Europe had become his classroom, war his context, and solitude his teacher. These years did not produce published works, but they forged the intellectual independence that defined his later career. Military service and travel were not detours from philosophy. They were essential stages in the formation of a thinker determined to rebuild knowledge on foundations stronger than tradition, custom, or force. The intellectual awakening of René Descartes emerged from a profound dissatisfaction with the knowledge he had inherited. Despite years of rigorous education and wide experience across Europe, Descartes found that most accepted doctrines rested on assumptions rather than proof. Philosophy was filled with disputes that never reached resolution, while science remained entangled with tradition and authority. This realization did not lead him to abandon reason, but to question how reason itself had been used. His awakening began with a simple but radical conviction. If knowledge was to be reliable, it required foundations that could not be doubted. This turning point crystallized during a period of intense solitude. Removed from academic institutions and social distraction, Descartes withdrew into deep reflection. In these moments of isolation, he confronted the unsettling idea that much of what he believed might be false. Rather than fearing this possibility, he embraced it as an opportunity. Doubt, he concluded, was not an enemy of truth, but its necessary starting point. By stripping away beliefs that could be questioned, he hoped to uncover something that could not. Central to this awakening was Descartes' recognition that certainty must begin within the mind itself. External authorities, books, traditions, and even sensory experience had proven unreliable. Senses could deceive, arguments could conflict, and customs could vary from place to place. Yet the act of thinking remained undeniable. Even in doubt, there was awareness. This insight marked a decisive shift in philosophy. Instead of beginning with the world, Descartes began with consciousness, placing the thinking subject at the center of inquiry. His search for certainty was guided by method rather than inspiration alone. Drawing on the clarity he admired in mathematics, Descartes sought rules for thought that would ensure reliability. He resolved to accept nothing as true unless it was perceived clearly and distinctly, to divide complex problems into simpler parts, and to proceed step by step from the simplest truths to more complex conclusions. This disciplined approach transformed doubt into a tool rather than a paralysis. Skepticism became constructive, aimed at rebuilding knowledge rather than destroying it. The awakening also carried ethical and existential weight. Descartes was not merely searching for correct answers. He was seeking intellectual peace. The constant disagreement among philosophers had left him dissatisfied and restless. Certainty, for him, promised stability in a world of shifting beliefs. By grounding knowledge in reason alone, he believed it might be possible to escape endless controversy and establish a universal framework for truth that could unite science and philosophy. This search did not yield immediate conclusions about nature, God, or humanity. Instead, it produced something more fundamental: a new starting point for thought. Descartes' awakening redefined what it meant to know. Knowledge would no longer be inherited or assumed, but constructed carefully from indubitable principles. This shift marked the birth of modern philosophy, where the individual mind became the measure of certainty. In the end, Descartes' intellectual awakening was not a single moment, but a sustained transformation. It was the realization that certainty must be earned through methodical reasoning and relentless self-examination. By daring to doubt everything, he discovered the conditions under which something could finally be known. The search for certainty became his life's project, reshaping philosophy by insisting that truth must begin not with tradition, but with thought itself. The decision of René Descartes to settle for long periods in the Netherlands marked one of the most productive and introspective phases of his life. Seeking distance from academic pressures, religious controversy, and social expectation, Descartes found in the Dutch Republic an environment uniquely suited to quiet study. The region offered relative intellectual freedom, political stability, and a culture tolerant of private inquiry. For a thinker determined to rebuild knowledge from its foundations, isolation was not a retreat, but a strategic necessity. Descartes lived in a series of modest residences across Dutch cities, deliberately avoiding notoriety and routine social life. He valued anonymity, believing that philosophical clarity required freedom from distraction. Days were structured around reading, writing, and extended periods of reflection. This self-imposed solitude allowed him to examine ideas slowly and critically, testing each conclusion against his developing method of doubt. Unlike university life, which demanded constant defense of opinion, isolation gave Descartes the space to think without interruption. The Netherlands also provided Descartes with indirect access to a vibrant intellectual world. Though personally withdrawn, he remained in correspondence with scholars, mathematicians, and scientists across Europe. Letters became a controlled form of engagement, allowing him to exchange ideas without surrendering solitude. Through this network, Descartes refined arguments, responded to criticism, and measured his ideas against emerging scientific discoveries. Isolation did not sever him from intellectual life. It allowed him to shape it on his own terms. It was during these years that Descartes made decisive advances in mathematics, optics, and metaphysics. Working alone, he developed new ways of linking algebra and geometry, revealing hidden structures beneath mathematical problems. His method emphasized clarity, order, and demonstrability, principles that mirrored his philosophical ambitions. The quiet discipline of his Dutch years enabled sustained concentration, making it possible to pursue complex ideas that required long, uninterrupted thought. Religious caution also shaped Descartes' isolation. Living in an age of theological tension and censorship, he was acutely aware of the dangers faced by thinkers whose ideas challenged established doctrine. The Netherlands offered comparative safety, yet Descartes remained careful, delaying publication and revising works repeatedly. He preferred certainty over speed, choosing to refine arguments until they could withstand both intellectual and religious scrutiny. Isolation thus became a shield, protecting the slow maturation of his thought. Emotionally, these years were marked by restraint rather than loneliness. Descartes valued independence and found contentment in intellectual self-sufficiency. Solitude was not experienced as absence, but as clarity. Freed from institutional obligation and public expectation, he was able to live according to the rhythms of thought rather than society. This inward life reinforced his belief that truth emerges most clearly when the mind is undisturbed. The years of study and isolation in the Netherlands were therefore not a pause between achievements, but the core of Descartes' intellectual formation. In quiet rooms and unfamiliar towns, he laid the groundwork for a philosophical revolution. Removed from noise, authority, and tradition, he shaped a new vision of knowledge rooted in reason alone. These years proved that isolation, when guided by purpose, could become the most fertile ground for transformation in the history of ideas. The development of the method of doubt is inseparable from the intellectual world of René Descartes, a world marked by deep uncertainty and radical change. Europe in the early 17th century was experiencing the collapse of long-held authorities. Medieval scholasticism was losing its grip, religious unity had fractured, and new scientific discoveries were undermining traditional explanations of nature. In this climate, Descartes sought not merely new answers, but a new foundation for knowledge itself. His method of doubt emerged as a response to this crisis, a disciplined attempt to rebuild certainty by first tearing down everything that could possibly be false. At the heart of the method lies a bold intellectual decision. Descartes did not doubt in order to remain skeptical forever, nor did he reject knowledge out of despair. Instead, he used doubt as a tool, deliberately and systematically suspending belief in anything that could be questioned. Sensory experience was the first target. The senses, he argued, have deceived us before. Objects appear bent in water, distant things look smaller than they are, dreams feel real while they last. If the senses can mislead even once, then they cannot serve as an unshakable foundation for truth. This step marked a dramatic break from earlier philosophies that trusted perception as a basic source of knowledge. From sensory doubt, Descartes moved to a more radical level by questioning reason itself. Mathematical truths, which seem clear and indubitable, were not exempt. He introduced the famous hypothesis of a powerful deceiver, sometimes called the evil genius, who could manipulate the mind into accepting falsehoods as absolute truths. This idea was not meant to be believed literally, but to push doubt to its logical extreme. By imagining that even logic and mathematics could be undermined, Descartes stripped away every belief that depended on external validation, authority, or habit. Yet this radical doubt did not lead to intellectual emptiness. On the contrary, it revealed something that could not be doubted at all. Even if an evil genius were deceiving him, Descartes reasoned, deception itself requires a thinking subject. Doubt presupposes a doubter. From this realization emerged the famous insight that thinking guarantees existence. The self, as a thinking being, stands firm even when everything else collapses. This moment is not merely a philosophical conclusion, but the turning point of the method. Doubt, having done its destructive work, now becomes the pathway to certainty. With this secure foundation in place, Descartes began the constructive phase of his project. The method of doubt was never intended to destroy knowledge permanently, but to purify it. Once the certainty of the thinking self was established, Descartes sought to rebuild knowledge step by step, relying only on ideas that were clear and distinct. Through this process, he argued for the existence of God as a non-deceptive being, which in turn restored trust in reason and, eventually, in the external world. What had been dismantled through doubt was carefully reconstructed on firmer ground. The lasting significance of the method of doubt lies in its transformation of philosophy itself. Descartes shifted the focus of inquiry inward, making the human mind the starting point of knowledge rather than tradition, nature, or authority. This move reshaped modern philosophy and influenced thinkers for centuries, from rationalists to skeptics, and even critics of his system. The method of doubt stands not as an invitation to endless questioning, but as a disciplined strategy for achieving certainty in an age of uncertainty, a method born from doubt, yet aimed decisively at truth. The phrase Cogito, ergo sum stands as one of the most decisive turning points in the history of philosophy, marking a moment when certainty was reclaimed from radical doubt. Formulated by René Descartes, the statement, "I think, therefore I am," did not emerge as a rhetorical slogan, but as the hard-won result of a profound intellectual struggle. Descartes lived in an age when traditional authorities were collapsing under the weight of scientific discovery and religious conflict. His aim was not simply to add another theory to philosophy, but to establish an unshakable foundation upon which all knowledge could securely rest. The Cogito arises directly from Descartes' method of radical doubt. By questioning everything that could possibly be false, sensory experience, inherited beliefs, even mathematical reasoning, he attempted to clear the ground entirely. This process was not driven by skepticism for its own sake, but by the desire to find something that could survive even the most extreme doubt. In the midst of this intellectual demolition, Descartes discovered a striking truth. While he could doubt the existence of the world, his body, or even logic itself, he could not doubt that he was doubting. The act of thinking itself confirmed the existence of the thinker. What makes the Cogito so powerful is its immediacy. It does not rely on observation, tradition, or inference from external evidence. Instead, it is grasped directly by the mind in the very moment of thinking. Descartes did not present it as a syllogism with premises and conclusions, but as a self-evident realization. The certainty of one's own existence is revealed through the act of consciousness itself. In this sense, the Cogito represents a new kind of philosophical grounding, one that begins not with the world, but with the thinking subject. From this insight, Descartes reshaped the foundations of philosophy. The thinking self became the first principle of knowledge, reversing centuries of philosophical tradition that had placed nature, God, or sensory experience at the center. This shift marked the birth of modern philosophy, in which the mind is treated as the primary source of certainty. Knowledge, according to Descartes, must proceed from what is clear and indubitable within consciousness, rather than from assumptions about the external world that may later prove unreliable. The Cogito also laid the groundwork for Descartes' broader metaphysical system. Once the existence of the thinking self was secured, he sought to demonstrate the existence of God as a perfect and non-deceptive being. This step was crucial because it allowed Descartes to restore trust in reason itself. If God is not a deceiver, then the clear and distinct ideas perceived by the mind can be trusted. In this way, the Cogito served as the first stone in a carefully constructed philosophical structure, leading outward from the self to God, nature, and scientific knowledge. The enduring influence of Cogito, ergo sum lies not only in its conclusion, but in its method and implications. It redefined what it means to be certain, placing subjective awareness at the heart of philosophy. Later thinkers would challenge, refine, or reject Descartes' conclusions, but none could ignore the shift he initiated. The Cogito transformed philosophy into a discipline that begins with the question of consciousness itself, shaping debates about mind, selfhood, and knowledge that continue to this day. In this sense, it remains not merely a famous phrase, but a foundational moment in the intellectual history of the modern world. The contributions to mathematics and analytic geometry made by René Descartes represent one of the most transformative moments in the history of mathematical thought. Living at a time when mathematics was largely divided between classical geometry and emerging algebraic methods, Descartes envisioned a unifying framework that could bring these traditions together. His ambition was not merely technical innovation, but the creation of a clear and systematic language capable of expressing spatial relationships with precision. In doing so, he reshaped mathematics into a tool suited for the new scientific age. Before Descartes, geometry was primarily visual and constructive, rooted in the legacy of Euclid. Algebra, by contrast, dealt with abstract symbols and numerical relationships, often disconnected from geometric intuition. Descartes' breakthrough lay in recognizing that geometric curves could be represented through algebraic equations. By assigning numerical values to spatial dimensions, he transformed geometry into an analytic discipline. Lines, curves, and shapes were no longer confined to diagrams alone. They could now be described, manipulated, and generalized using symbols. This conceptual leap opened geometry to a level of flexibility and power previously unimaginable. Central to this revolution was the development of what later became known as the Cartesian coordinate system. By introducing perpendicular axes to define position in space, Descartes provided a method for locating any point using numerical pairs. This seemingly simple idea had far-reaching consequences. It allowed complex geometric problems to be reduced to algebraic calculations and made it possible to study motion, curvature, and change with unprecedented clarity. The coordinate plane became a bridge between visual space and abstract reasoning, enabling mathematicians to translate intuition into calculation. Descartes presented these ideas most clearly in La Géométrie, published as an appendix to his broader philosophical work. Although the text was demanding and written for advanced readers, its influence was immense. He introduced systematic notation for unknowns and constants, helping to standardize algebraic expression. Equations were no longer isolated tricks or case-specific solutions. They became general tools applicable across many problems. This shift encouraged mathematicians to think structurally, focusing on relationships rather than isolated figures. The impact of analytic geometry extended far beyond mathematics itself. By providing a precise language for space and motion, Descartes laid essential groundwork for modern physics. Later thinkers, including Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, built upon Cartesian methods when developing calculus and mathematical physics. The ability to describe curves and trajectories algebraically was crucial for understanding planetary motion, mechanics, and change over time. In this sense, Descartes' mathematical innovations became foundational to the scientific revolution as a whole. Ultimately, Descartes' contribution to mathematics was not just the invention of new techniques, but a redefinition of how mathematical knowledge could be organized and expanded. By uniting algebra and geometry, he demonstrated that abstract reasoning and spatial intuition need not be rivals, but partners. This synthesis transformed mathematics into a dynamic, universal language, one capable of describing nature with clarity and rigor. The legacy of analytic geometry endures today, embedded in everything from engineering and physics to computer graphics and data science, reflecting the lasting power of Descartes' mathematical vision. The works of René Descartes on physics, nature, and the human body reveal a thinker deeply committed to explaining the world through reason rather than tradition. Although he is most famous for his philosophy, Descartes considered natural science an essential part of his intellectual project. He believed that a correct understanding of nature would follow from clear principles, much like mathematics. In an age still shaped by Aristotelian physics and medieval explanations, Descartes offered a radically new vision of the physical universe, one governed by mechanical laws rather than hidden qualities or purposes. In his approach to physics, Descartes rejected the idea that nature acts according to final causes or inherent goals. Instead, he described the material world as a system of matter in motion, operating according to strict laws established by God. Bodies, in his view, possess no inner purpose or life force. They move and interact purely through contact, size, shape, and motion. This mechanistic outlook transformed natural philosophy into a field closer to mathematics and geometry. Phenomena such as light, heat, and planetary motion were no longer mysteries explained by tradition, but problems to be analyzed through rational models. Descartes' theories of nature are most clearly expressed in his cosmological writings, where he presented a universe filled entirely with matter, leaving no room for empty space. He proposed that the motion of matter formed vast swirling systems, or vortices, which carried planets around the sun. Although later science would replace these ideas, the importance of Descartes' model lies in its method rather than its accuracy. He sought to explain the cosmos using consistent physical principles, treating the universe as a coherent mechanical system rather than a collection of isolated wonders. His interest in the natural world extended directly to the human body. Descartes approached anatomy and physiology with the same mechanical mindset, describing the body as a highly complex machine. Muscles, nerves, and organs were explained in terms of movement, pressure, and flow, not vital spirits or mystical forces. In works devoted to human physiology, he compared bodily functions to mechanical devices such as pumps, levers, and hydraulic systems. Breathing, digestion, and circulation were understood as physical processes governed by natural laws. One of Descartes' most influential ideas was his distinction between the body and the mind. While the body belonged entirely to the material world and followed mechanical rules, the mind was non-material and capable of thought, reason, and self-awareness. This separation allowed Descartes to study the human body scientifically without denying the existence of consciousness. Animals, he argued, were purely mechanical beings, functioning like complex machines without rational minds. Humans, by contrast, possessed both a mechanical body and a thinking mind, linked in a unique and problematic relationship. The significance of Descartes' work on physics and the human body lies in how it reshaped scientific inquiry. By insisting that natural phenomena could be explained through clear principles and mechanical processes, he helped break the hold of medieval natural philosophy. Even where his specific theories proved incorrect, his method inspired later scientists to seek rational, testable explanations of nature. Descartes did not simply describe the world as it appeared. He challenged thinkers to understand how it must function beneath the surface. In doing so, he helped lay the intellectual foundations for modern physics, physiology, and the scientific study of life itself. The relationship between René Descartes and the Church was marked by caution, restraint, and constant awareness of intellectual danger. Living in a 17th century Europe, where religious authority closely monitored new ideas, René Descartes understood that philosophy and science could not be separated from theology without consequence. The Catholic Church, still responding forcefully to the Protestant Reformation, was deeply sensitive to any doctrine that appeared to challenge Scripture, traditional cosmology, or established authority. Descartes' pursuit of rational explanation therefore unfolded under the shadow of potential censorship. A decisive moment shaping Descartes' caution was the condemnation of Galileo Galilei in 1633. Galileo's trial and forced recantation sent a clear warning across Europe. Even brilliant scientific reasoning could be suppressed if it conflicted with theological interpretation. Descartes was deeply unsettled by this event. At the time, he had nearly completed a major work on cosmology that implicitly supported heliocentric ideas. Fearing ecclesiastical punishment, he chose not to publish it. This decision reveals how seriously Descartes took the power of religious institutions over intellectual life. Rather than openly confronting church doctrine, Descartes adopted a strategy of careful alignment. He consistently affirmed his loyalty to Christianity and presented his ideas as compatible with faith. God played a central role in his philosophy, not as a distant concept, but as the guarantor of truth, order, and reason. By grounding natural laws in divine creation and insisting that God was not a deceiver, Descartes framed his rational system as reinforcing, rather than undermining, religious belief. This theological framing was not merely philosophical, it was also a protective measure. Even so, Descartes remained wary of how his ideas might be interpreted. He avoided public controversy and preferred to circulate his work privately among trusted scholars. When he did publish, his language was often deliberately restrained, avoiding direct challenges to church authority. He emphasized method rather than doctrine, presenting his work as a neutral search for certainty rather than a revolutionary worldview. This intellectual discretion allowed him to push boundaries while minimizing the risk of direct confrontation. Despite these precautions, Descartes' works were not entirely free from suspicion. After his death, some of his writings were placed on the Index of Prohibited Books in certain Catholic regions, particularly because of their implications for theology, the nature of the soul, and the relationship between reason and faith. Critics feared that his emphasis on human reason as the starting point of knowledge could weaken reliance on religious authority. What had once been framed as compatible with faith was now seen, by some, as a potential threat to it. The story of Descartes' relationship with the Church is therefore one of balance rather than rebellion. He was neither a martyr of free thought nor a submissive defender of orthodoxy. Instead, he navigated a complex intellectual landscape with strategic care, advancing new ways of thinking while respecting the limits imposed by his age. His experience illustrates the tension between emerging modern philosophy and traditional religious authority, a tension that would shape European thought long after his lifetime. The major works of René Descartes, Discourse on the Method and Meditations on First Philosophy, stand at the very foundation of modern philosophy. Written in different styles and for different audiences, these two texts form a unified intellectual project. Together, they reveal Descartes' ambition to establish a new path to knowledge, one grounded not in authority or tradition, but in reason disciplined by method. Through these works, Descartes reshaped how philosophy would be practiced for centuries to come. Discourse on the Method, published in 1637, is both philosophical and deeply personal. Unlike the dense scholastic treatises of his time, it is written in a clear and accessible style, almost as an intellectual autobiography. Descartes recounts his dissatisfaction with traditional education and explains how he resolved to rebuild his knowledge from the ground up. Rather than presenting a finished system, the work introduces a method, a set of rules for thinking clearly, dividing problems into simpler parts, and proceeding step by step from what is certain to what is complex. This emphasis on method rather than doctrine marked a decisive break with medieval philosophy. In the Discourse, Descartes also introduces some of his most revolutionary ideas in a restrained and careful manner. He outlines his approach to doubt, his commitment to clarity and certainty, and his vision of science as a unified enterprise grounded in mathematics. Yet many of his most radical claims are only sketched rather than fully argued. The work functions as an invitation, encouraging readers to follow the method themselves rather than accept conclusions on authority. In this sense, the Discourse is as much a guide to intellectual self-discipline as it is a philosophical text. Meditations on First Philosophy, published several years later, takes a very different approach. Written in a rigorous, reflective style, it is addressed primarily to learned readers and theologians. Here, Descartes no longer narrates his intellectual journey, but reenacts it step by step. Each meditation represents a stage in the process of radical doubt and reconstruction. The reader is invited to experience uncertainty, isolation, and gradual clarity alongside the philosopher. This structure gives the work an almost dramatic quality, as certainty slowly emerges from doubt. Within the Meditations, Descartes develops his most famous arguments in full detail. He establishes the certainty of the thinking self, argues for the existence of God, and seeks to restore confidence in reason and the external world. Unlike the Discourse, which emphasizes method and moderation, the Meditations confronts foundational metaphysical questions directly. It engages deeply with theology, addressing potential objections and anticipating criticism. This careful engagement reflects Descartes' awareness of religious authority and his desire to present his philosophy as compatible with Christian belief. Taken together, Discourse on the Method and Meditations on First Philosophy reveal two sides of the same project. One introduces a new way of thinking in an open, almost conversational tone. The other rigorously defends the philosophical foundations of that way of thinking. Their combined impact was immense. They shifted philosophy toward the subject, emphasized clarity and rational justification, and inspired generations of thinkers to question inherited assumptions. More than individual masterpieces, these works form the cornerstone of a new intellectual era, one in which reason, guided by method, became the primary tool for understanding reality. The invitation to Sweden and the final years of René Descartes mark a quiet yet dramatic conclusion to a life devoted to thought After decades spent in relative isolation, Descartes found himself summoned into the political and intellectual center of a northern court. The invitation came from Queen Christina of Sweden, a young monarch renowned for her exceptional intellect and deep interest in philosophy. She sought not merely a court scholar, but a teacher capable of guiding her through the most demanding questions of reason, ethics, and metaphysics. For Descartes, the invitation was both an honor and a risk. He had long preferred a life of privacy, believing that philosophical clarity flourished best away from public distraction and controversy. Yet Queen Christina's reputation as a serious and independent thinker persuaded him that Sweden might offer a rare opportunity, a ruler genuinely committed to philosophical inquiry. In 1649, after much hesitation, Descartes agreed to travel to Stockholm, leaving behind the relatively mild climate and familiar routines of continental Europe. Life at the Swedish court quickly proved more demanding than Descartes had anticipated. Queen Christina insisted on holding philosophy lessons early in the morning, often before dawn, in the cold halls of the royal palace. Accustomed to working late at night and sleeping into the morning, Descartes struggled to adapt to this new schedule. The harsh Scandinavian winter, combined with the physical strain of early rising and the damp climate of Stockholm, took a serious toll on his health. What had begun as an intellectual honor soon became a severe personal challenge. Despite these difficulties, Descartes remained committed to his duties. He lectured the Queen on philosophy, ethics, and the nature of reason, attempting to translate complex ideas into forms suitable for a ruler's education. He also became involved in broader cultural projects at court, including plans for an Academy of Sciences in Sweden. Even in declining health, Descartes continued to think systematically, demonstrating the same discipline and dedication that had defined his entire career. In early 1650, only a few months after his arrival, Descartes fell seriously ill. Most historical accounts describe his condition as pneumonia, likely aggravated by the cold climate and exhausting routine. On February 11, 1650, he died in Stockholm, far from the quiet intellectual life he had carefully cultivated for decades. His death was sudden and, to many of his contemporaries, deeply ironic. A philosopher who had sought certainty through reason was undone by the uncontrollable forces of nature. Descartes' final years in Sweden give his life a distinctly human ending. They reveal a thinker drawn out of solitude by the promise of intellectual dialogue, only to encounter the physical limits of the body he had so carefully analyzed in theory. Yet his death did not diminish his influence. On the contrary, it cemented his legacy as a foundational figure of modern thought. The ideas he developed in isolation now spread rapidly across Europe, shaping philosophy, science, and the understanding of human reason long after his final winter in Stockholm had passed. The death, influence, and intellectual legacy of René Descartes together form one of the most enduring narratives in the history of Western thought. His death in 1650, far from his homeland and under physically harsh conditions, seemed at first like a quiet and almost accidental ending to a life devoted to abstract reasoning. Yet this ending only marked the beginning of his true historical presence. In the decades following his death, Descartes' ideas spread rapidly across Europe, provoking admiration, controversy, and deep philosophical transformation. Descartes' passing in Stockholm was sudden, but its intellectual consequences were anything but. Almost immediately, his works became central texts in universities and learned circles. Students and scholars debated his method, his conception of the mind, and his approach to science with extraordinary intensity. What made his philosophy so influential was not merely its conclusions, but its starting point. By grounding knowledge in the thinking subject, Descartes shifted the entire direction of philosophy. Questions about certainty, consciousness, and reason could no longer be avoided or treated as secondary issues. His influence was especially powerful in shaping modern rationalism. Later philosophers who emphasized reason as the primary source of knowledge found in Descartes both a model and a challenge. Even thinkers who rejected parts of his system were forced to define themselves in relation to him. His insistence on clarity, method, and systematic doubt set new standards for philosophical rigor. Philosophy was no longer a matter of commentary on ancient authorities. It became an active investigation grounded in critical self-examination. Beyond philosophy, Descartes left a lasting mark on science and intellectual culture. His mechanistic view of nature encouraged scientists to search for mathematical laws underlying physical phenomena. Even when his specific theories were later abandoned, his approach helped establish the expectation that nature could be explained through rational principles rather than tradition or mystery. In this sense, Descartes became a symbolic figure of the scientific revolution, representing the confidence that human reason could uncover the structure of reality. Descartes' legacy also includes controversy and resistance. Religious authorities, philosophers, and theologians alike questioned the implications of his emphasis on human reason. Some feared that beginning with the thinking self weakened the authority of tradition and faith. Others argued that his separation of mind and body created problems that philosophy still struggles to resolve. These debates did not diminish his importance. Instead, they ensured that his ideas remained central to philosophical discussion long after his lifetime. Today, Descartes stands as a defining figure of modern intellectual history. His name is inseparable from questions about consciousness, certainty, and the foundations of knowledge. The phrase modern philosophy itself is difficult to imagine without his presence. Though centuries have passed since his death, the problems he raised continue to shape debates in philosophy, science, and the study of the human mind. In this enduring influence lies Descartes' greatest legacy, not a closed system of answers, but a method and vision that continue to challenge how humanity understands itself and the world.